Once upon a time, there was a young woman named Emily who loved hiking. She had been on many hikes in her life and always felt confident in her ability to navigate through the wilderness. But one day, she went on a hike in a new area, and things didn't go as planned. As she walked deeper into the forest, she realized that she had taken a wrong turn somewhere. She tried to retrace her steps, but it only seemed to make things worse. Before she knew it, the sun began to set, and darkness began to creep in. Emily felt a growing sense of panic as she tried to find her way back to the trailhead. She called out for help, but no one answered. She was truly lost. As the night progressed, Emily's fear only grew stronger. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made her jump. She tried to keep moving, hoping that she would find her way out, but it only seemed to lead her deeper into the wilderness. Finally, exhausted and scared, Emily collapsed under a tree and tried to rest. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She heard strange noises and saw shadows moving in the trees. As the night wore on, Emily realized that she was not alone in the woods. Something was stalking her, something dark and sinister. She tried to run, but the woods seemed to twist and turn in on themselves, trapping her in a maze. Finally, just as the first light of dawn began to appear, Emily stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a decrepit old cabin. She hesitated for a moment, but the thought of being lost and alone in the woods was too much to bear. Emily slowly approached the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the window, she saw a pair of eyes staring back at her, eyes that belonged to something that was not human. With a scream, Emily turned and ran back into the woods, desperate to get as far away from the cabin as possible. She eventually stumbled upon a park ranger who helped her find her way back to the trailhead. But Emily would never forget the terror of that night, or the feeling of being lost in the woods with something sinister lurking just beyond her vision. She never hiked alone again, and the memory of that night haunted her for the rest of her days. It was a dark and stormy night, and Samantha was driving alone on a deserted road. She had been on the road for hours and was tired and hungry. As she drove, she saw a sign for a small town up ahead and decided to stop for a meal and a place to rest for the night. As she drove into the town, she noticed that it was eerily quiet. The streets were empty, and the buildings looked old and abandoned. She found a diner and parked her car outside, but when she walked inside, she found that it was empty. Ignoring her unease, Samantha sat down at the booth and called out for a waiter. But no one answered. She decided to get up and leave, but as she stood, the door to the diner suddenly slammed shut, trapping her inside. Panic set in as she tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching her from the kitchen. She turned around to see a tall figure in a dark cloak, its face obscured by shadows. The figure moved towards her slowly, and Samantha could feel her heart racing in her chest. She tried to scream, but her throat was dry, and no sound came out. Just as the figure was about to reach her, the lights in the diner flickered on, revealing an empty kitchen and no one in sight. Samantha was left alone, shaken and terrified. She managed to force the door open and ran to her car, driving away as fast as she could. But as she looked back, she could swear she saw the dark figure standing at the edge of the street, watching her with an otherworldly gaze. Sarah and her friends were always looking for something exciting to do on the weekends. One Saturday evening, they decided to explore the abandoned hotel on the outskirts of town. The hotel had been closed for years, and the rumor was that it was haunted. As they entered the hotel, they could hear the sound of their footsteps echoing throughout the empty halls. The air was musty and damp, and they could feel a chill running down their spines. They wandered around the deserted lobby, looking for anything interesting. Suddenly, they heard a faint sound coming from upstairs. They cautiously made their way up the creaky staircase, trying not to make a sound. When they reached the top floor, they saw a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and they could hear a soft whisper coming from inside. Sarah slowly pushed open the door and they all peered inside. The room was dark, and they could barely make out a figure in the corner. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they realized that it was a woman sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, and muttering to herself. Suddenly, the woman stopped rocking and looked up at them with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. She stood up and started walking towards them, but her movements were unnatural, almost like a zombie. The group of friends tried to run, but the woman was too fast. She grabbed Sarah by the hair and pulled her back, while the rest of her friends ran down the stairs. They could hear Sarah's screams echoing through the hotel as they made their escape. Years later, the hotel was demolished and a new building was erected in its place. However, some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear Sarah's screams and the sound of the ghostly woman roaming the halls of the new building. There was once a young woman named Emily who had just moved into a new apartment. It was an old building with creaky floors and drafty windows, but Emily didn't mind. She was excited to start this new chapter in her life. But as soon as she settled in, strange things started happening. At first, it was just small things, like a dish moving from one counter to another or a door closing on its own. Emily tried to brush it off as her imagination, but she couldn't ignore it for long. One night, she woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. She was alone in the apartment, but the footsteps grew louder and closer until they stopped right outside her bedroom door. Emily was paralyzed with fear, but after a moment of silence, the footsteps retreated back down the hall. The next day, Emily asked her landlord if anyone had ever died in the apartment. The landlord hesitated before telling her that the previous tenant had died in her sleep just a few months ago. Emily felt chills run down her spine. As the days passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent and intense. Emily would wake up to find her furniture rearranged, her clothes thrown on the floor, and strange whispers in the middle of the night. She started to feel like she was losing her mind. One night, she decided to take a sleeping pill to help her sleep through the disturbances. But instead of finding peace, she had a nightmare that she was being chased by the ghost of the previous tenant. The ghost was whispering her name and Emily could feel her icy breath on her neck. When Emily woke up, she found that she was no longer alone in her bed. The ghost of the previous tenant was lying next to her, staring at her with cold, dead eyes. Emily screamed and ran out of the apartment, never to return. Years later, the building was torn down and replaced with a new one. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers of the ghost of the previous tenant, searching for her next victim. Once a successful businessman, John had it all: a beautiful family, a luxurious house, and a promising career. However, things started to take a dark turn when he began feeling a strange presence around him. At first, it was just a feeling of unease, a sense that something was off. But as time passed, John felt like he was losing control of his own mind. It started with forgetfulness, small lapses in memory that he attributed to his busy schedule. But soon, it became clear that something more sinister was at work. John started having vivid nightmares, dreams that felt all too real. In them, he was visited by a shadowy figure, a shapeless mass that whispered to him in a language he couldn't understand. Each night, the figure came closer, its presence suffocating him until he woke up gasping for air. But the nightmares were just the beginning. John began to experience strange sensations, as if something was crawling under his skin. His thoughts became muddled, and he found himself unable to focus on even the simplest tasks. Desperate for answers, John turned to doctors, therapists, and even spiritual healers, but no one could offer any explanation for his condition. As the days passed, John's grip on reality grew more tenuous. He found himself losing control of his body, acting on impulses that he couldn't explain. One night, as John lay in bed, he felt a cold breeze wash over him. The room grew darker, and he knew the figure from his nightmares was near. As he struggled to keep his eyes open, he saw the shadowy mass take shape before him, its form becoming clearer and more defined. In a moment of clarity, John realized that the entity was not outside of him, but inside. It had been slowly taking over his mind, using him as a vessel for its own nefarious purposes. With a final burst of willpower, John fought back against the darkness, screaming for it to leave him alone. When he woke up the next morning, John felt a sense of relief wash over him. The presence was gone, and he was in control of his mind once again. But he knew that the entity was still out there, waiting for its next victim to come along, and he vowed to never let his guard down again. Emma had always been fascinated with the supernatural. She spent her free time reading books about ghosts, demons, and other creatures that lurked in the darkness. One day, she stumbled upon an old book that promised to reveal the secrets of an ancient ritual that could summon a demon. Curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to try it out. She gathered all the necessary ingredients, drew the pentagram, and began the chant. At first, nothing happened. But then, she felt a chill run down her spine. She could feel the air getting colder, and she could hear whispers in the darkness. Suddenly, she was pulled into a different realm, one that was filled with horrors beyond her imagination. Demons roamed the land, and tortured souls screamed in agony. She tried to run, but she was trapped, unable to escape. As the days passed, Emma began to change. She could feel the demon's influence slowly taking over her mind. She started to hear voices in her head, telling her to do unspeakable things. She knew that she had made a terrible mistake, and that she had to find a way out. But the demon wouldn't let her go that easily. It continued to torment her, driving her to the brink of insanity. Emma knew that she had to fight back. With all the strength she had left, she mustered up the courage to confront the demon. It was a fierce battle, but in the end, Emma emerged victorious. She banished the demon back to its own realm, and returned to the world of the living. But the experience had changed her forever. She knew that she could never forget the horrors that she had witnessed, and that she would carry the scars with her for the rest of her life. As a child, Jamie had always been fascinated with the abandoned house at the end of the street. The windows were boarded up, the roof was caving in, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. Many kids claimed to have seen strange things happening in and around the house, but Jamie never believed them. Until the day he decided to explore the abandoned house himself. He slipped through the gap in the fence and pushed open the front door. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. The floorboards creaked and groaned under his weight as he made his way through the darkened hallway. He heard whispers and murmurs echoing in the distance, but he couldn't quite make out what they were saying. Jamie crept up the stairs, his heart racing with anticipation. He pushed open a door and found himself in a dusty bedroom. The furniture was covered in cobwebs, and the bed was unmade. But what really caught his attention was the old-fashioned vanity mirror. It was ornately carved, and the glass was darkened with age. As he looked into the mirror, Jamie saw a figure standing behind him. It was a tall, gaunt man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. He wore a tattered suit, and his skin was pale and waxy. Jamie turned around, but there was nobody there. He turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, looming behind him. Jamie tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure reached out a bony hand and touched Jamie's shoulder, and a chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, he was falling through the darkness. When he woke up, Jamie was lying on the floor of the abandoned house. The sun was setting outside, and he realized he'd been unconscious for hours. He stumbled to his feet and ran all the way home, vowing never to set foot in the abandoned house again. But that night, he had a nightmare. He dreamed of the gaunt figure from the mirror, standing at the foot of his bed. The figure leaned in close and whispered in his ear, "You can never escape me." Jamie woke up screaming, and he knew he would never be truly free of the abandoned house and the darkness that lurked within it. Once there was a guy named Alex who loved to explore the unknown and paranormal. He had heard about an old cemetery near his town, which was known for being haunted. He had been told that strange things happened there after midnight and that people had seen ghosts wandering around the cemetery. One night, Alex decided to explore the cemetery on his own. He arrived at the cemetery gates around 2 a.m. and walked in. The silence was eerie, and the only sound he could hear was the rustling of leaves under his feet. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making it difficult to see. Alex started to regret his decision, but he shrugged it off and continued to walk deeper into the cemetery. As he walked, he started to feel a chill in the air. He began to see shadows moving around the graves and heard strange noises around him. He tried to ignore them, thinking that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper calling out his name. He turned around to see where the sound was coming from, but there was no one in sight. He continued to walk, and the whispering grew louder, more persistent. He felt like something invisible was following him, getting closer and closer. He decided to pick up his pace and started to run, but his feet got tangled up with something, and he fell. As he tried to get back up, he felt something cold and bony grabbing his ankle, trying to pull him down into the ground. He screamed and struggled, but the grip was too strong. Eventually, he managed to break free and ran as fast as he could. He could hear the sound of someone or something chasing him, getting closer and closer. When he reached the cemetery gates, he looked back and saw a figure in the darkness, standing still and watching him with glowing eyes. Alex never returned to the cemetery again. He was never the same after that experience and would often wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone invisible was still trying to grab his ankle and pull him back into the darkness. There was a young couple, John and Sarah, who decided to go on a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the woods. As they arrived at the cabin, they noticed that it was very old and creepy looking, but they shrugged it off as part of its charm. As the night fell, they lit a fire and snuggled on the couch to watch a movie. But something felt off. John kept hearing strange noises coming from outside the cabin, but every time he looked out the window, he saw nothing. Sarah noticed John's unease and suggested they go to bed early. As they lay in bed, John tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise coming from the living room. He got up to investigate, and as he entered the room, he saw that the door was open, despite him having locked it before going to bed. John and Sarah began to panic, feeling like they were being watched by an unknown presence. They decided to leave the cabin immediately, but as they were packing their bags, they heard footsteps coming from the attic above them. John tried to keep his composure and told Sarah to stay put while he went to check. But as he climbed the stairs to the attic, he saw a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. John froze in terror as the figure began to approach him, slowly revealing its grotesque face. Sarah heard John's scream and rushed to the stairs, but as she got there, she saw nothing but an empty attic. John was never seen or heard from again, and Sarah was left alone to wonder what happened to her beloved partner in that remote and creepy cabin in the woods. There was a small town nestled deep in the mountains, where the winters were long and brutal. Every year, when the first snowfall hit, the town would close down and the residents would hunker down in their homes, waiting for the spring thaw. But one winter, something strange happened. A young couple, Tom and Emily, moved into a cabin on the outskirts of town. They were excited to start their new life together in the quiet, secluded wilderness. But as the snow piled higher and higher outside, they began to feel uneasy. Strange noises echoed through the woods, and Emily could feel a presence watching them from outside. One night, as they were lying in bed, they heard a faint scratching sound at the door. Tom got up to investigate, but found nothing outside. As they were settling back in, they heard the scratching again, louder this time. Tom opened the door and shone his flashlight into the darkness, but still saw nothing. The scratching continued every night, growing louder and more persistent. Emily became convinced that something was trying to get in. She begged Tom to leave, but he refused, saying that they had nowhere else to go. One night, as they were sitting by the fire, the scratching began again. But this time, it was accompanied by a low growling sound. Tom stood up and grabbed his shotgun, ready to defend himself and Emily. But as he opened the door, a hand reached out from the darkness and pulled him outside. Emily heard his screams as he was dragged away, and she knew she was next. She barricaded herself inside the cabin, but the scratching grew louder and more frenzied. And then, all of a sudden, it stopped. The next morning, when the snowplows came through, they found Emily huddled in the corner of the cabin, her hair turned completely white from shock. She could barely speak, but managed to utter one word, indigo.